All right, welcome back, everybody. Today we begin our largest unit, our last unit of the semester. This is a 4-week unit. We're going to go over 2 books. And the general issue, the general question at hand is the history of the American Catholic Church. And we're going to be reading 2 books. The first book is Anti-Catholicism in America, 1620 to 1860 by Maura Jane Farley. And the second book by Russell Shaw, American Church, The Remarkable Rise, Meteoric Fall, and Uncertain Future of Catholicism in America. And these 2 books go together quite well, even though they weren't intended to go together necessarily. And what they do is, in general, trace 3 movements, we can say, in the history of the American Catholic Church. The first one, as indicated by the text of Maura Jane Farley's book, is an anti-Catholicism in America. In the beginning, prior to colonies, then the revolution, up until we're going to talk about when that ends, but the book ends at the end of the 19th century. And we're going to see how few Catholics there were in America. They were centralized in certain cities or Maryland, and most Americans had never met a Catholic. Certainly during the colonies. And you're going to see why there's such an anti-Catholicism in America and how it's a bit different from an anti-Catholicism in in Europe. The anti-Catholicism in the United States was grounded, as we'll see today, in a suspicion that Catholicism was dangerous to this new American project. So it's not simply Protestantism versus Catholicism, though that's certainly part of it. It's Protestantism in America worried that Catholicism will be an impediment to the expansion and creation of what we now know of the United States. The second book then talks about, the Russell Shaw book, talks about 2 other themes. So moving from anti-Catholicism to the end of the 19th and beginning of the early 20th century, you have mass migration from Europe, from places like Ireland and Italy, etc., and go into places like, think of Boston, right? Today we think of Boston as a hub of Irish Catholicism, but prior to the 19th century, that was certainly not the case. It was, in fact, the exact opposite. Massachusetts was sort of hub of anti-Catholicism, if you will. So you have this mass migration of Catholics into the United States, and a question in this sort of second movement there is has to do with enculturation, right? This idea of, okay, you've got Irish who certainly speak English, but then you have others. You have Germans, you have Italians who don't speak English. They come to the United States, they start learning English. Certainly their children and their grandchildren learn English. But the question is enculturation, and that means how much can and should Catholics want to be American? And as we'll see in our unit today, the Protestants at the time, and many today still say that Catholics can't be Americans, not fully Americans, that their loyalties are divided, and so therefore Catholics are suspicious in that way. So this question in this second period or second movement of Catholic history is, should Catholics who migrate to this country become fully American? Should they want to fully embrace the American vision? And that includes things like a democratic way of governance, right? So democracy, we talked about that in this class, as you know, the rule of the people. Of course, we don't actually live in a democracy. We live in a republic. And the question of sort of governance by the people, let's just put it that way. Whereas, of course, we saw in Europe, we talked a little bit about the French Revolution and how that wounded Catholicism deeply in Europe. And even until this day, the French Church, Catholic Church, is deeply wounded by that. And so there's a deep suspicion of the French Revolution and democratic or Republican, small r Republican movements, including our own. So you're an immigrant, you come over from Italy. Should you want to be fully American, including embracing that sort of governance by the people? So that was a kind of debate in the end of the 19th, early 20th century. Then what Shaw is going to do is he's going to say, okay, by the time you get to the mid-20th century, let's say, the answer to that question for the most part has been answered. And the answer is yes, Catholics coming from Europe decide that they want to be enculturated, they want to be fully American. And then the question that Shaw then asks, and he offers his opinion is, at what cost, right? And he would point to things like, decline in church membership in the past 75 years, et cetera, as a variety of different reasons, but in large part because of this idea of Catholics think not that much differently than the larger dominant American culture, right? So if the larger dominant American culture says, contraception is a good thing, statistically speaking, we can see Catholics in this country contracept statistically as about the same amount as the dominant American culture does. So American Catholics do become enculturated, fully embrace this American project, this American experiment, if you will. But the question is at what cost? And of course, this is something that we're going to talk about in class. Many Catholics today, in the past, I'd say 20 to 30 years, are even pushing back on this. And this is something that we've talked about. For example, in class, the Rod Dreher book, The Benedict Option, which is why we read earlier in the semester the Benedict, the Rule of Benedict from St. Benedict. We had a whole week on that, and we talked in class about the Benedict option, and should that model of drawing on the Rule of St. Benedict be something that should be a larger discussion and movement in the Catholic Church today. This idea of saying, maybe we shouldn't be fully enculturated, that has not been good for Catholics. So these three sort of movements: anti-Catholicism in America, mass migration around the beginning of the 20th century. Should Catholics want to be fully American? By the mid-20th century, the answer is yes. Catholics do want to be fully American. What are the consequences? What are the implications? What are the good things about that? What are the bad things about that? So that's the general arc of what we're going to be doing over the next 4 weeks. So today we're spending 2 weeks reading this book, the Farley book. And so what I want to do is talk about sort of anti-Catholicism in the United States up to and sort of through the American Revolution. And then next week we're going to finish this book and then move on to the Shaw book. So why, before we jump into the text itself, just a couple of questions. Why talk about anti-Catholicism, right? Certainly, we only have a few weeks to do this, so we want to stay focused on one particular topic. This is an important topic in the history of the American Church. So it still exists today, anti-Catholicism. Admittedly, not as pronounced as in the past, and that's largely, I would say, because of what we were just saying, that American Catholics did fully embrace the sort of American vision of things. So the suspicion of Catholics as not being fully American, that has diminished. Again, there are still some people who are suspicious of that. The mark, and we'll talk about this during the Shaw book, the mark of the sort of the classic definition of the end of anti-Catholicism in the United States comes with the 1960 John F. Kennedy presidential election, who, of course, is our first Catholic American president. And this is in contrast with an earlier Catholic in the 20th century who ran for president and lost quite badly, was Al Smith. And he was not the most charismatic individual, but most scholars would point to the fact that his Catholicism is really what did him in when he lost the presidential race. So then we jump to 1960. And we'll talk about this in detail, but yes, Kennedy's Catholicism was an issue, but ultimately he did become the president. And of course, now, later on we have President Biden, the second Catholic president in this country. And during the election, the 2020 election, there was no discussion whatsoever of his Catholicism. So people want to point to that as a marker of, look, anti-Catholicism is dead. I would argue it's still around, but not as pronounced as it used to be. So that's one of the reasons we want to talk about anti-Catholicism. Number two, we need to talk about anti-Catholicism because it informs our understanding of how we should relate to Protestants. We've talked a bit about this. We talked about the Protestant Reformation extensively and the Catholic response to that in the 16th century. We talked about the Vatican II documents and how they talked about Protestants as our separated brothers and sisters, as opposed to describing them as heretics and schismatics. So that calling them brothers and sisters is a softer language, though still recognizing that there is a separation, that we are not in full communion with each other. So, yes, we have these sort of Vatican documents, and they're great, but we also have to understand the historical context out of which we American Catholics come from, and so we need to talk about that. Number three, why are we talking about anti-Catholicism? Well, it's an important part of American history that we generally don't learn about in high school. Certainly I, as someone who went to public school, we never talked about this sort of thing. And I would venture to say that even in American Catholic schools growing up, K through 12, probably didn't talk much about this. So this is something that most American Catholics don't even know about today. So I think it's important that we talk about it for that reason. Another is that it's a particular manifestation of a larger question of Catholicism and culture. That is, can Catholics be fully American? And as we'll see in this unit, in this book, first book in particular, the Protestant answer is no. Again, that those Catholics are dangerous because their allegiance is divided, right? That they're going to be loyal to Rome. And so what does that mean? What are the implications of that? If, for example, the United States get into a war, are American Catholics going to fully fight, going to be willing to die for whatever cause the United States is fighting for? And so you have this suspicion of Catholics. And we'll get more into this with the Shaw book. This is an important question that we Catholics need to ask, and I was hinting at this with the Rod Dreher book. And should we want to be fully American, right? That our citizenship, as all Christians, frankly, this is not a Catholic claim, all Christians should recognize that their citizenship is ultimately with heaven. So even if we have a sort of earthly citizenship for a particular country, yes, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And we can pledge allegiance to the flag, but we believe in one God, the Father Almighty. And I think the difference between that allegiance and believing is fundamental. The belief in God and His Church should take precedent over earthly loyalties, earthly citizenships. And so then what is the implication for that for Catholics? So this is important because it brings up that larger question of how much can and should Catholics and all Christians be inculturated into a particular culture. I think our Protestant brothers and sisters should be asking this question as well. And maybe they shouldn't be as excited to fully embrace American culture as we've seen in the past. And then, of course, the last reason why I think this is important to talk about anti-Catholicism is the pastoral application. We need to talk about our citizenship and how much we should and want to be part of a dominant American culture. So why don't we begin with the prologue or the introduction, the preface to Maura Jane Farley's book. So you want to pull this out and read along with me here. This is Roman numeral 12, not number 12, but Roman numeral 12 in the preface. This comes in the middle of the text, that middle paragraph there. And what the author here is doing is she is giving us here the sort of thread that weaves its way throughout American history and the sort of root cause or foundation of anti-Catholicism. Quick side note, I interviewed Dr. Farley, the author of this book, for our podcast, Catholicism and Culture, a few years ago. A wonderful conversation. We talked about, for example, how does anti-Catholicism manifest itself today in the 21st century, and other things in her book. So I'll be sure to include a link to that podcast interview. All right. So what again is the foundational issue or the thread that weaves its way through the different manifestations of anti-Catholicism? So she says, the Catholic Church represented different threats to different Americans at different points in time. And yet, over the course of the 2.5 centuries that this book explores, one characteristic of the threat remained constant. Catholicism was, at all times, seen as antithetical to freedom. Freedom, in turn, was seen as the foundation of American identity. Whether that identity belonged to the Puritans in the 17th century, the Patriots in the 18th century, or the Unitarians and Nativists in the 19th century. Any understanding of anti-Catholicism, then, requires us to interrogate the meaning of American freedom and, by extension, the promise of American identity. The history of anti-Catholicism asks us to consider why, as a culture, we have sometimes built fences around the promise of American identity, thereby excluding some people from that promise, even as we have clung to the idea that the freedom at the core of the American identity is universally human right, available to everyone. So what is the thread that weaves its way throughout anti-Catholicism in this country's history? The idea of freedom. As we're going to see in the rest of this video, admittedly, Protestants and Catholics do have a different definition of freedom, and because that definition of freedom is different from Protestants and Catholics, the Protestants were suspicious of the Catholic definition and then the implications of that definition. So the Catholic freedom, and we'll get more into detail into this later, we talked about, for example, going back to the unit on the rule of St. Benedict, that again there is a different definition that Protestants have, and there is a thread throughout Catholicism of the idea of obedience, right? Obedience to the church in general. And one thing that we've already talked about was obedience in the rule of St. Benedict. Let me just reread something that we talked about weeks ago. This is from the prologue of the rule of Benedict. In fact, this is the very first paragraph. So the prologue begins, "Listen carefully, my son, to the master's instructions, and to attend to them with the ear of your heart. This is advice from a father who loves you. Welcome it and faithfully put it into practice. The labor of obedience will bring you back to him from whom you have drifted through the sloth of disobedience. This message of mine is for you then, if you are ready to give up your own will once and for all, and armed with the strong and noble weapons of obedience to do battle for the true King, Christ the Lord." So what Benedict, of course, is talking about is ultimate obedience to Christ, right? Christ's will, that we should have our hearts conformed to Christ's will. But more immediately, as the rule goes on that we talked about, obedience specifically to the abbot. And the first section, you'll remember, of the rule of St. Benedict goes in great detail about who is the abbot, what is the role of the abbot, how does the abbot relate to his fellow brothers in the monastery. And there is the expectation of obedience. Starting with Martin Luther and moving on to Protestants today, there's a deep suspicion of that idea. Certainly the rejection of monasticism in general, a rejection of hierarchy for most Protestants. There's no pope, there's no bishops. Even the idea of priests is suspicious. Certainly there is, you can talk about ministers or pastors, But in the Protestant churches, those people are generally not ordained in any way. They may have gone to school, to a seminary, and gotten extensive education, but there's no sort of hierarchy, right? They're just people who are articulate, they're charismatic, they have high education, they know the Bible better than most people in their communities. But there is no hierarchy there, and especially in this country, when you have things like Methodists and Baptists, evangelicals, there's a deep suspicion of hierarchy and obedience. So right off the bat, there is this idea of obedience in the Catholic Church, that we do have a hierarchy, and that this is seen as suspicious by many Protestants. Also, there's the assumption of that's lurking in the background from Farley's claim, and that is a different ecclesiology, a different understanding of what the church is. And this gets us back to Lumen Gentium, the document from Vatican II, which is arguably the most important document in the history of Catholicism about the church. What is the church? We talked about that. And remember, we talked about the invisible church and the visible church. The visible church, in part, having to do with those visible structures, right, that we have a Vatican, we have, hierarchy, popes, bishops, etc. And the ecclesiology, the study of the church, the understanding of the church, in the Protestant world is different. And that difference in understanding of ecclesiology leads to this different understanding of hierarchy and the necessity of being obedient to it, and then therefore a different vision of freedom. We didn't read this text together. One text we did read was the Babylonian captivity of the church, but another one from Martin Luther in 1520. So this is before he is fully excommunicated, but after the 95 Theses in 1517. The text is called The Freedom of a Christian in 1520. So right off the bat, you can hear that word freedom. So this idea of freedom that we have in the forefront of our American understanding, our American identity or cultural assumptions, is secularized today. Freedom from government restraints is a common refrain. But originally, this idea was a sort of Christian Protestant understanding, freedom from those Catholic entanglements. So the American understanding of freedom comes out of a Protestant understanding of freedom. Let's jump to page 17. And what this is going to do is give us a vision of how Protestants thought of Catholics, and specifically how the Protestant understanding of how Catholics are not free, that they are sort of slaves to Catholicism, to the Pope, to their bishops, then manifests in a particular vision of what a Catholic is, or who a Catholic is, and how he or she lives. So this is bottom of page 17, that paragraph there on Calvinism and liberty. When Robert Brown described Catholics as mastered in 1582, he helped to create a template that would be utilized by Protestants in the Anglo-American world for many centuries to come. As late as the 1870s, the American political cartoonist Thomas Nast was carefully depicting the quote-unquote dullness that Brown had insisted could be easily spied in all Catholics nearly 300 years earlier. The characters Nast created for Harper's Magazine had eyes that reflected no light and faces that revealed no curiosity. Their posture was hunched and submissive, and their gait was more characteristic of an ape's or a servile animal's than a human being. Nast's Catholics were ignorant and ignoble, and the reason for their drabness was perfectly clear. Their natures had been rendered dull and their intelligence unremarkable by generations of deference to the whims of their clergy. What, of course, is sort of lurking on here in the background is the idea of slavery in the United States, right? That slaves have to be obedient to their masters, and they have this sort of dullness. There's no light in their faces. They're beasts of burden. They're animals. They're not really truly fully human. And the same idea is applied to American Catholics. Because they are slaves, if you will, they have to be obedient. They don't have the freedom that American Protestants have. That leads to this sort of dullness, posture hunched and submissive. Their gait was more characteristic of an ape's or a servile animal. So this idea that a Catholic is not that much better, frankly, than a slave, even though there is a dramatic difference in Southern plantation slavery and a freeman Catholic who's walking around. But interiorly, the slavery is sort of the same, right? It's not being able to exercise your freedom, and that manifests itself over centuries in a sort of dullness. Let's now dig more deeply into this question of, okay, Protestants reject Catholicism because it's seen as lacking in freedom. And I did say that Catholics and Protestants do have different definitions of freedom. So what are those different definitions, and what are the sort of implications of that? So let's start on page 75, and this has a sort of Protestant definition of freedom. And as you read in the book here, the beginning of this American experiment, there were distinct Protestant groups, as there are today, but they saw themselves as distinct, right? That the Methodists and the Anglicans, they were both Protestants, but they did not see themselves as brothers and sisters in arms against Catholics. But then as time develops, you see this sort of pan-Protestantism that develops that I think still exists today. The distinctions or the theological lines or the cultural lines between these different groups have sort of gotten a little fuzzy, and you have a sort of pan-Protestantism. So again, what is the question here? The question is, what is the Protestant definition of freedom? And then we'll come to what is the Catholic definition of freedom. This is the middle of page 75. But many people in the lower 13 colonies also genuinely believed that the Catholic faith could be antagonistic to freedom, and freedom was the foundation that they wanted their new country to be built on. Following the Glorious Revolution, the vast majority of people in the English-speaking world believed it was the job of the state to protect human freedom. The problem with the king and parliament, according to the patriots, was that both entities were no longer doing that, and freedom for most English speakers was defined exclusively in Protestant terms. And then here's the key point here for Protestants. Freedom was the absence of mediation or outside restraint. It was the power of acting as one thinks fit, in the words of the 18th century English jurist William Blackstone, whose legal and philosophical commentaries were consulted by members of the First and Second Continental Congress and the U.S. Constitutional Convention. Blackstone understood that membership in a society that meant that people couldn't always act as they thought fit. For the sake of peace, people came together and agreed to laws that restrain their behaviors in some way. Such restraints, however, should extend no farther than is necessary and expedient for the general advantage of the public, according to Blackstone. Proper societies were ones that defined freedom as the absence of outside restraint, even as they accept the necessity of certain restraints. Proper societies also understood that some freedoms, the freedom to own property, for example, or to assemble openly with one's peers, were a right inherent in us by birth. Such rights could not, therefore, ever be restrained, modified, or fortified, regardless of what anyone perceived to be necessary. Now, this probably doesn't sound particularly remarkable to you. As I said earlier, that this Protestant definition of freedom has become the sort of standard American definition of freedom, even in a sort of secularized version. What is freedom? Freedom is the absence of mediation or outside restraint. It was the power of acting as one thinks fit, right? So nobody can and should tell me what to do. The government shouldn't tell me what to do. The laws, any religious leaders, even my parents, once I become an adult, my parents shouldn't be telling me what to do. So absence of restraint. So freedom here is defined as freedom to do whatever I want, right? Freedom to do something. So in a sense that freedom is for its own sake, right? Freedom is its own end, right? Freedom to be free, to do whatever I want. Yes, we have to restrain ourselves in certain ways. We have to follow the law, and the law says, you should only drive your car 75 miles down the highway. And okay, for the sort of sake of the common good, so that we're not all killing each other in our cars because we're all driving 120 miles an hour, fine. For that sort of general sense of the common good, for personal safety, all right, I'll allow myself to be restrained. But even then, I sort of bristle at that, right? But any demands on me beyond that is an impingement upon my freedom. And again, we see this as sort of downstream of that 16th century Protestant rejection of the Catholic Church. Remember, we saw when we talked about Protestantism, the claim that Protestants say, well, everyone should be able to read the Bible, and not just read it, but read it to define for themselves doctrine, right? And whereas Catholics say, well, you can read the Bible, you should read the Bible and read it for your spiritual nourishment, but it's the place of the church to define doctrine, right? And so there you see a sort of limitation on an individual freedom. And so the Protestants reject that. Also rejection of the hierarchy, specifically the priests, right? You have to go to a priest when you commit a mortal sin, confess your sin, and only the priest acting in persona Christi can forgive you of your sin, where the Protestants reject that, and they say, I can and should go directly to God, no intermediary between me, and that this mediator of the priest is restricting on my freedom, right? Just practically speaking, right? That I have to go at a certain time on a certain day to see a priest to confess. Well, why can't I just be able to confess anytime I want? Just get down on my knees and ask God for forgiveness. Another example, we saw that it's the priests, bishops, the hierarchy that does things like baptize, right? Or consecrate the bread and wine. Whereas in Protestant circles, for the most part, sort of any even baptized Christian can baptize somebody else. So the freedom for anyone to baptize. So a complete rejection of hierarchy at all. So again, in summary, freedom is the freedom to do something and not have any restraints on me whatsoever. Now let's talk about the sort of Catholic understanding. Catholics do believe in freedom. It's just a different definition of freedom. And so it's not that we are slaves, though we've talked about the idea of obedience. It's a different definition. So let's read the Catholic definition of freedom, and you can tell me which definition you think is better. So let's just jump a couple of pages ahead. This is page 77. Page 77. This is a Catholic definition of freedom coming out of Pope Leo XIII. I don't think we've talked about Pope Leo XIII, but he's very important. He was the Pope immediately after Pope Pius IX, whom we talked about as the longest serving Pope. Leo is probably best known for one of his encyclicals called Rerum Novarum, which is on new things. This is often considered the first Catholic social encyclical from a pope at the end of the 19th century. You'll read this in your social teachings class. It talks about economics, basically. So in other words, this is not a letter that has to do with doctrine, like our understanding of Mary or the Trinity or something like that. So that's what Leo is known for. But this is coming, this discussion here about Leo is coming from a different document than he wrote. So the first full paragraph on page 77. Freedom for a Catholic was not something a person was born with, as people such as William Blackstone insisted it was rather something a person achieved. The reason many people imagined that the church is hostile to human liberty, Pope Leo XIII explained, was that human beings tended to pervert the very idea of freedom, or they extend it at their pleasure to many things in respect of which man cannot rightly be regarded as free. The ability to act as one thinks fit did not, in of itself, constitute freedom, according to Leo. Quote, man is indeed free to obey his reason and seek moral good, the Pope observed. Yet he is free also to turn aside to all other things, and in pursuing the empty semblance of good, to disturb the rightful order and to fall headlong into destruction which he has voluntarily chosen. Human beings had the power to think it fit to act in ways that were sinful. The possibility of sinning, Leo insisted, is not freedom, but slavery. When a man sinned, he became a slave to the passions that fueled that sin, and people chose to sin because they were incapable on their own of understanding the will of God. Quote, the human condition of human liberty therefore necessarily stands in need of light of strength to direct its actions to good and to restrain them from evil. Without this, the freedom of our will would be our ruin. All right, what's Leo getting at there? What's his point about freedom? So we said that the Protestant definition of freedom is the freedom to do something without restraints. Catholicism flips that on its head, and Catholicism says that true freedom is freedom from something, not to do whatever you want, but freedom from the radical slavery of sin so that I can choose the good. Not choose whatever I want to do, but choose the good. True freedom is the freedom from the radical slavery of sin so that I can choose the good. Because what Leo is getting at there is, well, if true freedom is the freedom to do whatever I want, well, because of things like my disordered passions, original sin, my desires, that if I really go down that path is going to lead me to sin, right? So if my disordered sexual will says I want to have sex with as many people as I possibly can, and true freedom is not restraining myself in that way, well, that's going to lead me down to sin, and I'm going to pursue my passions as much as I can. So absolute liberty without restraints is sort of a libertinism, right? It's just doing whatever you want, and that will lead us to sin. So we have to sort of not follow our conscience immediately, but we should first form our conscience through virtues, through the progress of the spiritual life, have our conscience be rightly ordered, and then follow it when it's rightly ordered, when it's well formed. But of course, it's never perfectly formed. So we always have to be sort of suspicious of our conscience. And so we shouldn't be just listening to ourselves and our desires, but we should be listening to the saints, right? Listening to Jesus. So, for example, let me boil this down to a basic example. Imagine yourself going into the grocery store, and you're standing there in the aisle that has all of the cereals, right? And it can get quite overwhelming, right? The number of options that you can choose on any given day for the different cereals. You've got Sugar Pops, and you've got Kellogg's Rice Krispies, and you've got Cinnamon Toast Crunch, and then think of all the chocolatey series, right? Cereals. A Protestant definition of freedom would say, I should be able to choose any of these cereals I want, and nobody should tell me which one to pick. So the government shouldn't tell me, the grocery store shouldn't tell me, my parents shouldn't tell me, my friends shouldn't tell me, the society shouldn't tell me. Nobody should be dictating to me what cereal I should choose. I should have the freedom without restraints to choose whatever cereal I want. Catholic definition would say, I need to be free. True freedom is to be free from my radical slavery to my passions of sin so that I can choose the good. And what is the good in this particular case? Well, the good is to choose a healthy cereal, right? That my body is a gift given to me by God. I should treat that gift with respect. That I shouldn't, abuse my body through eating so much bad food that I get diabetes, for example, or massive obesity. So true freedom, Catholic would say, is, in this case, that I have harnessed through the spiritual progress, through the virtues, my desire, because let's be honest, I've got a sweet tooth and I want to get those sugary sweet cereals. I want to get the chocolatey sweet cereals because I like chocolate. But I need to rein in my passions to choose the good. And what's the good? Well, let's be honest. It's the granola with the raisins that isn't loaded up with sugar. It has a sort of, a balance of protein and carbohydrates, etc. Now, let's also be honest that that cereal is not going to taste as good as the sugary sweet cereals, right? But if I simply allow myself to be without restraints, then I become a slave to my passions, and in this case, the slave to my passionate desire for sugary cereals, which if you eat them from time to time, okay, that may not be a problem. But if I do that over and over and over again, that's going to lead to a problem in my health. So true freedom is harnessing those desires over a lifetime of development, of spiritual progress, so that I can choose the good, and the good is choosing that healthy cereal, because the healthy cereal is for the good of my body, and even if it doesn't taste as good, well, we know it's better for us, right? And that we have to be willing to not insist on the best tasting cereal if it's not as healthy for us as the granola cereal. So there, again, you have two different definitions of freedom. The freedom to do whatever I want, which is the Protestant definition, without restraint, and then the Catholic definition, freedom from the radical slavery of sin so that I can choose the good. One other quick example of this before we move on is Mary. We often talk about Mary, who was without original sin. And of course, at the Annunciation, she says, let it be done unto me according to thy word, right? That she's presented with the option of receiving our Lord. And she could have said no, right, if she wanted to, but she says, let it be done according to me, according to thy word. So there's a question there of freedom. And it's a good sort of theological question, and we can ask the question, did Mary have the freedom to choose to say no? And a Catholic understanding would be that because she did not have original sin, Mary was the most free person because she didn't have original sin. Right? She did not have those same passionate attachments, those same disordered desires that you and I had. This does not mean that she was free to say no to the gift of the incarnation, but that she was liberated from her sinful, selfish desires so that she could choose the good. And the good, of course, is the good for her own personal salvation, but also the sin of all of our salvation. So she was the most free person, not because she could say no, although she did have the ability to say no, but that wasn't what makes her free. What makes her free is that she did not have original sin, and so she was liberated from her passionate desires so that she could choose the good. And the good in this case was to say yes to that gift that was offered to her. So there would be other people, you and me, who do suffer from original sin, who might hesitate to say yes, to say, let it be done according to thy word, for a variety of reasons, right? If you know you're going to give birth to the Savior, that's going to cause heartache for you. Think about, Mary at the foot of the cross, for example, right? Because she said yes, that brought deep suffering to her as she saw her child on the cross. There are countless ways that saying yes could cause her problems. Think, another one that we see at the beginning of Matthew, the Gospel according to Matthew, is, she was betrothed to Joseph. So Jesus is not Joseph's son. They're not married. And initially, Joseph was going to sort of quietly divorce her. So this could have caused scandal for her. So those of us who are sort of worried about social scandal or the way that people think about us might hesitate to say, well, I don't know if I want to go through that. That's going to cause me ostracization in society. I don't want that, especially if you're a young Jewish girl, probably opening up to the door the possibility that you'll never get married, that you will sort of be what we would call a single parent, not have financial stability and social stability of being in a marriage, right? So all of us who suffer from original sin, understandably, might hesitate to say, let it be done according to thy word. But Mary didn't suffer from those. So she was the freest person of all to choose the good. Let it be done according to thy word. All right, the last section we're going to read here from the Farley book, at least for today's unit, is page 93, please, page 93. So the question now is, well, what's at stake? We've talked about these two different definitions of freedom, the Protestant definition, the Catholic definition, the freedom to do whatever you want without restraints, freedom from radical slavery of sin so that we can choose the good. What's at stake here? This is not simply an abstract theoretical question, but in the eyes of Protestants in particular, the reason, the problem of the Catholic understanding of freedom becomes sort of practically problematic in this sort of American experiment. So this is very top of page 93, that first full paragraph there. To be sure, Atwood was no revolutionary. He and the lay Catholics who utilized his argument in the 1730s and 40s were not bold enough to insist, as the Patriots later would, that they were no longer English subjects. In many respects, Maryland's Catholics did not have the freedom in the first half of the 18th century to make such an audacious claim. Many people in North America and England, after all, and here's the key part, were arguing that Catholics could not be good Englishmen by virtue of their enslavement to the Pope in Rome. There was much about what it meant to be an Englishman that Maryland's Catholics wanted to claim for themselves. However, the right to be represented in the legislative deliberations that govern their lives, for starters. Catholics were therefore uninterested in the early decades of the 18th century, at least, in throwing off the mantle of English identity. So, what's at stake here? What's at stake is that these American Protestants then look suspiciously at American Catholics and say, you are not fully American, you are not fully a part of this experiment, this new project. Initially, in those early years, it has to do with being a good Englishman, right? Because the beginning of this book talks extensively about England and English Protestantism in the 17th and 18th centuries, and how that attitude from England and the issues there about popery become central to American Protestants. And then later on, as the colonies broke away and formed their own country, the same sort of issue is at stake. So initially, it's you Catholics can't be good Englishmen because you're divided. Your loyalties are with the Pope. But now, after we become our own republic, the question becomes, okay, you Catholics can't be fully American because you're divided loyalties. And this in fact, goes back to the early church, right? That we talked about this in the very first video, that during the Age of Martyrs, during the Roman Empire, Christians were looked on suspiciously for a variety of reasons. We talked about how there was this rumor that they were cannibals because they ate the body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus. But that they weren't fully citizens because they weren't willing to sacrifice animals to the Roman gods, and they weren't willing to recognize the Roman emperor as a sort of demigod or semi-divine or a divine figure. So because Christians refused to do that, they were looked on suspiciously, that they're not fully Roman citizens and they're therefore suspicious in some way. What are their motives and how might they undermine the Roman Empire, the Roman stability, the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome? Same sort of move going on here in initially in the American colonies and then later in the American Republic. This idea that if you are committed to the Pope in Rome, you have divided loyalties, and then therefore you are looked on suspiciously because you're not in it with us American Protestants, that you don't have the same goals that we have. So it's not simply that you have a different abstract definition of freedom, but you're not on the same page with us in this American experiment, so therefore you're suspicious. Maybe you shouldn't be seen as full citizens. And the Farley book does talk, for example, about how at certain points during in Maryland in particular, that there were restrictions placed on Catholics on how much they could have political roles, right? How much they should govern. Because if you are a Catholic in Maryland and you are in a place of political power over other Protestants, but you have divided loyalties, that your loyalties are truly with Rome, then the policies that you're going to enact are ultimately for the good of Rome and not good for the country, the United States, and not good for the state of Maryland, and ultimately not good for those American Protestants in Maryland. So a deep suspicion there. Now, another thing that Farley does talk about is the idea of the difference of the reality between sort of Catholicism as an idea and actual Catholics, right? And Farley does sort of mention that the distinction lies in the fact that oftentimes, especially in places like Maryland, Catholics and Protestants were related to each other, maybe by marriage, or maybe, your brother-in-law is a Catholic and you're a Protestant. And so you know the people that you're related to. Obviously you're in love with your spouse if your spouse is Catholic and you're Protestant. And so it gets sort of complicated and tricky, the distinction between the suspicion of Catholicism as an idea or as a religion, and then the reality of knowing Catholics in your community, maybe working with them or being related to them in some way, and how that plays itself out differently on the ground level. So several things to questions to think about, and we'll have time to talk about this in our discussion. That the Protestants are not entirely wrong in the sense that we do have a different definition of freedom. As Catholics, we would argue that it's a better definition of freedom, but it is different. And we do have a hierarchy. We do believe in obedience ultimately to the church. We do believe that our ultimate citizenship is in heaven, that it's not of this world, and that we can pledge allegiance to the flag, but our ultimate loyalty isn't to the state. Our ultimate loyalty is to Jesus Christ. And we Catholics should ask the question, should we ultimately want to be good Englishmen or today good Americans? And that this is a theme that we'll continue to see over the next 3 weeks and have to question ourselves right up until the present, especially when we get into this question of enculturation with the Shaw book in that around the early 20th century with the mass migration to this country from those European Catholics. So the Protestants aren't 100% wrong in their analysis of Catholicism. Does that analysis lead to their fear that Catholics can't be good citizens, good Englishmen, or good Americans? And should we even want to? Should we want to be good Americans, or should that be a sort of second level priority? And what are the implications of having it being a second level priority? So this is what we'll be talking about in class. So this is the end of the first half of the Farley book, and then next week we'll get to the second half, sort of American Revolution up until just before the Civil War.